I pulled my water bottle from my pack and took a long drink, checking my watch. 3:17 in the afternoon. We'd been hiking for about 4 hours now, and the group was handling the pace better than I'd expected. 8 years of leading survival training treks through Pine Ridge, and I'd learned to read people pretty quickly. This group had a good mix of experience levels, which usually made for the best learning environment. Gabriel walked a few steps ahead, crouched low near a fallen log, examining something in the dirt. His tracking skills impressed me more each time we stopped. The kid had natural instincts that couldn't be taught, the kind of awareness that separated weekend hikers from people who actually understood the wilderness. "Bear tracks," he called back to the group. "Old ones, maybe 3 days, heading east toward the creek." Tim immediately pulled out his phone, probably hoping to get a photo, but I knew he wouldn't find signal out here. The college enthusiasm was endearing, even if it meant I had to keep redirecting his attention from documenting everything to actually learning the skills we came here to practice. Skye nodded at Gabriel's observation, adjusting her pack straps. She moved with the confidence of someone who spent serious time outdoors, not just the occasional weekend trip. Her gear was quality stuff, well maintained, and she hadn't complained once about the pace or the terrain. Having another experienced hiker in the group always made my job easier. Bella stayed close to Terry, both of them looking a bit winded but keeping up. Terry's business clothes weren't exactly ideal for wilderness hiking, and Bella's sneakers were going to give her problems if we hit any serious inclines, but they were both trying hard. Sometimes the most determined students learn the most, even if they started with the least experience. I pulled out my GPS unit to check our position. We were following the marked trail toward the overnight camping spot I'd used dozens of times before, a clearing about 2 miles ahead with good water access and natural windbreaks. The route was straightforward. Stay on the main trail for another 1.5 miles, then take the fork that led down toward Willow Creek. The GPS screen flickered to life, and I waited for it to lock onto our coordinates. When the display stabilized, I stared at the numbers for a moment, then checked them again. We were nearly 1/2 mile off course, heading northwest instead of northeast. That didn't make sense. I'd walked this trail so many times I could navigate it in the dark. I stopped walking and pulled out my paper map, spreading it against a tree trunk. The GPS coordinates put us in a section of Pine Ridge I'd never explored, even though it was only a short distance from the established trails. 8 years of guiding groups through these woods, and I'd always stuck to the routes I knew were safe and well maintained. "Everything okay?" Skye asked, noticing I'd stopped. I traced our path on the map with my finger, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. The trail junction where we should have turned east was clearly marked, and I remembered passing it. Or at least, I thought I remembered passing it. But the GPS didn't lie, and neither did the topographical features I could see around us. The mistake bothered me more than it should have. Navigation was basic stuff, the foundation of wilderness safety. I'd drilled it into hundreds of students over the years. Always know where you are, always have multiple ways to find your way back. Yet here I was, leading a group of people who trusted my experience, and I'd managed to get us lost on a trail I could supposedly hike blindfolded. "We need to backtrack," I announced to the group. "About 1 mile, I took a wrong turn somewhere." Gabriel looked surprised. Really, the trail seemed pretty clear. That was the problem. The trail had seemed clear to me too. Whatever path we'd been following felt legitimate, well-worn enough that I hadn't questioned it. But trails could be deceptive, especially in areas where deer or other wildlife created paths that looked man-made. Tim pushed his glasses up his nose. "How do you know we're off course?" I held up the GPS unit. "These coordinates don't match where we should be. The camping spot is northeast of our starting point, but we've been heading northwest for the past hour." Bella looked nervous, glancing around at the trees as if they might provide some reassurance. "Are we lost?" "No," I said firmly. "We're just not where we planned to be. Big difference. I know exactly where we are now, and I know how to get us back on track." That was mostly true. The GPS gave me our position, and the map showed the terrain features that would guide us back to the main trail. But the fact that I'd made the navigation error in the first place left me feeling unsettled. Mistakes in the wilderness had consequences, and even small ones could cascade into serious problems if you weren't careful. Terry wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. How much extra distance are we talking about? Mile back to where we went wrong, then maybe another 2 miles to the camping spot. So, about an hour of additional hiking, assuming we maintain this pace. I started folding the map, but Bella's voice stopped me. "What's that?" She was pointing through the trees to our left, where something dark and angular broke the natural lines of the forest. I followed her gaze and saw the corner of a structure, mostly hidden behind a cluster of pine trees and overgrown vegetation. "Looks like a building," Tim said, already taking a few steps toward it. I studied the shape through the trees. It was definitely man-made, too regular and vertical to be anything natural. But there weren't supposed to be any structures in this part of Pine Ridge. The Forest Service maps didn't show any cabins or ranger stations in this area, and I'd never heard of any historical sites this deep in the wilderness. Gabriel moved closer, trying to get a better view. "Looks old. Maybe some kind of hunting cabin?" The building was maybe 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trees and undergrowth. What I could see looked like weathered wood siding and a steep roof, the kind of construction that suggested it had been there for decades. But something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what triggered that instinct. "We should check it out," Skye said. "Might be interesting from a historical perspective." Tim nodded eagerly. "Yeah, and maybe there's information about the trail system, old maps or something." Every survival instinct I'd developed over 8 years of wilderness guiding was telling me to walk away. Abandoned buildings in remote areas could be dangerous for a dozen different reasons. Unstable structures, wildlife dens, illegal activities, or just the general principle that if something looked out of place, it probably was. But the group was already moving toward the building, curiosity overriding caution. Tim and Skye led the way, with Gabriel following close behind. Bella and Terry hung back near me, but they were watching the others with interest. 5 minutes, I said, making the decision I knew I'd probably regret. Quick look, then we head back to the trail. I took the lead as we pushed through the undergrowth, keeping my hand near the knife on my belt. The building resolved into clearer detail as we got closer. A single-story house with a covered porch, built from logs and rough-cut lumber. The roof looked intact, but the wood siding was gray and weathered, stained by years of rain and snow. Windows flanked a heavy wooden front door, but they were too dirty to see through. No power lines or other signs of modern utilities, which made sense given the remote location. But the construction looked solid, not like some ramshackle hunting shack thrown together from scrap materials. "Who would build a house all the way out here?" Bella asked quietly. That was exactly what I was wondering. The location made no sense for a permanent residence. Too far from roads, too isolated from any community. But it was too substantial to be a temporary shelter, and too well built to be some kind of illegal operation. Gabriel walked around the side of the building, checking the perimeter. No obvious damage. Foundation looked solid. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. I approached the front door, noting that it was slightly ajar. The wood was thick and heavy, fitted with old-style iron hardware that had rusted, but still looked functional. A small window next to the door was covered with grime, but I could make out the edge of what looked like furniture inside. The smart move was to turn around and leave. Abandoned buildings were unpredictable, and I had 5 people depending on my judgment to keep them safe. But my curiosity was fighting with my caution, and the group was already committed to exploring. I pushed the door open with my foot, letting it swing wide before I stepped across the threshold. The hinges creaked loudly, but the door moved smoothly, not catching or sticking like I'd expected. The smell hit me immediately. decay mixed with something sweet and wrong, like flowers left too long in a stagnant water. I breathed through my mouth and took a careful step inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior. The main room was larger than I'd expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows on two sides that let in filtered light through decades of dirt and grime. The furniture was old but substantial. A wooden table, several chairs, a bookshelf against the far wall. Everything was covered with dust, but nothing looked damaged or disturbed. But it was the painting above the fireplace that caught my attention. A large canvas in an ornate frame showing a woman in a white dress standing in what looked like a garden. The brushwork was detailed and skillful, but something was wrong with the woman's face. It was deliberately blurred, as if the artist had smeared the paint while it was still wet, obscuring her features into an indistinct oval. "This is incredible," Sky said, stepping up beside me. "The preservation is amazing for something this old." Tim was already exploring the bookshelf, running his finger along the spines of leather-bound volumes. "Some of these books look ancient, like seriously old." Gabriel appeared in the doorway, holding a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. "Found this on the porch. There's a note with it." He set the box on the table and pointed to a piece of yellowed paper beside it. The handwriting was faded but still legible, written in old-fashioned script with what looked like fountain pen ink. I picked up the note and read it aloud. "When shadows dance and spirits call, seek the truth within these walls. Where light breaks through night's domain, the secret waits through joy and pain." The words sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. It read like some kind of riddle or puzzle, the kind of cryptic message that suggested whoever lived here had been interested in things that went beyond normal wilderness living. Bella moved closer to Terry, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This place feels wrong, like we shouldn't be here." I was starting to agree with her. The house was too well preserved, too carefully arranged, as if someone had just stepped out temporarily rather than abandoning it years ago. And that painting kept drawing my attention, the blurred face seeming to watch us despite having no visible features. Gabriel opened the wooden box, revealing what looked like old photographs and documents. But before anyone could examine them more closely, a sound echoed from outside that made everyone freeze. It was a screech, high-pitched and definitely not human. Not quite animal either, but something in between that raised every hair on the back of my neck. The sound lasted for several seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. "Out," I said immediately. "Everyone out, now." The box tumbled from Gabriel's hands as we all bolted for the door. I pushed past Terry and Bella, shoving the heavy wooden door wide open as my boots hit the porch boards. Behind me, chairs scraped against the floor and someone knocked into the table. The whole group was moving at once, a mess of elbows and backpacks trying to squeeze through the doorway. I jumped down from the porch and spun around, counting heads as everyone stumbled out behind me. Gabriel emerged first, then Sky, then Terry pulling Bella by the arm. Good. Everyone was out. My hand went automatically to my belt, fingers brushing the knife handle as I scanned the tree line around us. The forest looked exactly the same as when we'd arrived. Tall pines, thick undergrowth, dappled shadows, nothing moving, nothing making noise. Just the normal sounds of wind through the branches and our own heavy breathing. But that screech had come from somewhere close. Something was out there. Then I heard it again. The sound ripped through the air, starting low and climbing to that same impossible pitch that made my teeth ache. But this time it was different. Closer. Much closer. The first screech had seemed to come from maybe 100 yards away, somewhere deeper in the forest. This one sounded like it was right on top of us. "Move," I said, grabbing my pack from where I'd dropped it by the porch steps. "We're leaving now." I didn't wait for questions or complaints. My survival training had kicked in completely, overriding everything else. Unknown threat, unknown capabilities, group safety compromised. The only smart move was to get distance and reassess from a safer position. I headed straight for the gap in the trees where we'd originally entered the clearing, moving fast but trying not to run. Running led to panic, and panic got people hurt. Behind me, I could hear the others scrambling to grab their gear. Skye was right on my heels, her breathing controlled and steady. She understood the urgency without needing an explanation. Gabriel and Tim were close behind, their footsteps crunching through the pine needles and fallen branches. Terry was breathing hard already, and Bella made a small whimpering sound that told me she was scared out of her mind. Good. Fear would keep them moving. I pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at my sleeves as I tried to retrace our path back toward the main trail. The forest felt different now. Heavier, like something was watching us from between the trees. Every shadow looked wrong. Every movement in my peripheral vision made my muscles tense. I'd spent 8 years guiding people through wilderness areas, and I'd developed decent instincts for when something was off. Right now, every instinct I had was screaming danger. A branch snapped somewhere behind us, not behind the group. Behind us and to the left, back toward the house. Something big moving through the trees, not bothering to be quiet about it. "Cole," Skye whispered, her voice tight. She'd heard it too. I stopped and held up my hand, signaling for everyone to freeze. The group bunched up behind me, and I could feel their fear like heat radiating off their bodies. Terry was practically panting. Bella had grabbed onto his arm and was gripping it hard enough that her knuckles were white. Another branch snapped, closer this time. Whatever was following us was gaining ground, and it was moving through the forest faster than anything that size should be able to move. I could hear undergrowth being crushed and pushed aside, like something was just plowing straight through instead of picking its way around obstacles. That wasn't normal animal behavior. Bears were big and could move fast when they wanted to, but they didn't crash through the forest like bulldozers. Mountain lions were silent. Even elk and deer, which could be noisy, didn't sound like this. This sounded like something that didn't care about stealth anymore. "We need to run," I said quietly, turning back to face the group. "Stay together. Follow me. Don't stop for anything." Tim opened his mouth like he was going to ask a question, but I was already moving. I pushed through a thick stand of pine saplings, their branches whipping back behind me. The main trail was maybe 50 yards ahead if I'd judged the distance right. Once we hit the trail, we could move faster, put some real distance between us and whatever was back there. The crashing sounds were getting louder, not just louder, faster. Like whatever was following us had stopped trying to be careful and was now moving at full speed. I could hear entire saplings being snapped off, the sharp crack of breaking wood echoing through the trees. My blood went cold. Nothing moved through dense forest like that. Nothing natural. "Run!" I shouted over my shoulder. "Run now!" The group broke into a sprint behind me. I could hear their footsteps pounding against the forest floor, their breathing getting ragged as fear and exertion hit them all at once. Terry was already falling behind. His office job hadn't prepared him for this kind of physical demand, and his inappropriate clothing was making everything worse. I reached the edge of the main trail and burst out of the tree line, my boots hitting the packed dirt of the hiking path. The familiar trail markers and worn ground should have been reassuring, but the crashing sounds behind us were getting closer. Whatever was following us had closed the distance while we were running. Gabriel emerged from the trees next, his face flushed but his breathing still controlled. Then Skye, moving with the same efficient stride she'd maintained all day. Tim stumbled out of the undergrowth, his camera bag bouncing against his hip as he tried to keep up. Where were Terry and Bella? I spun around, looking back toward the tree line. They should have been right behind Tim. Terry was slow, but Bella had been keeping up fine during the regular hike. They couldn't be more than a few seconds behind. "Terry!" I called out. "Bella!" the crashing sounds stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest. No wind, no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Even the normal background noise of the wilderness had gone dead quiet, like every living thing was holding its breath. Then I heard Bella scream. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, high and terrified and full of pain. It came from back in the direction of the house, maybe 30 yards into the trees, but it cut off abruptly, like someone had clamped a hand over her mouth. "Bella!" Terry's voice shouting from the same direction. "Bella, where are you?" I started back toward the trees, but something made me stop. Terry's voice had sounded wrong, not just scared. Wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. The tone was right, the words were right, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Terry!" I shouted back. "Where are you? Keep talking so I can find you." No response. The forest had gone silent again. Gabriel was already moving toward the tree line, his jaw set in determination. "We have to go back for them." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. Something was very wrong here. Bella's scream had been genuine terror, I was sure of that. But Terry's voice afterward had sounded off, too calm, too controlled for someone whose hiking partner had just screamed and disappeared. "Help me!" came a voice from the trees. Bella's voice weak and frightened. "Please help me, I'm hurt." Gabriel pulled against my grip, trying to head toward the sound. "She's injured. We have to help her." But I was staring at the tree line, my mind racing. Bella's voice was coming from the wrong direction. She'd been behind Tim when we started running, which meant she should be between us and the trail. The voice was coming from deeper in the forest, back toward the house. "I can't move," Bella's voice called out again. "My leg is trapped. Please don't leave me." The voice was definitely Bella's. Same pitch, same scared tone she'd been using all day, but it was coming from at least 50 yards away, and there was no way she could have gotten that far off course in the time we'd been running. "Cole," Skye whispered next to me. Her face had gone pale. "That's not right." She was thinking the same thing I was. The voice was perfect, but the location was impossible. "Please," the voice called out again, but this time it wasn't Bella's voice, it was Terry's. "Please don't leave me out here," Terry's voice said from the exact same location where Bella's voice had been coming from. "I'm lost. I can't find the trail." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Terry's voice was coming from the same spot in the forest, but Terry had been behind Bella when we started running. There was no way both of them had ended up in the exact same place, 50 yards off course, without us hearing them crashing through the undergrowth. Gabriel was staring at the tree line now, his face confused and frightened. "How are they both in the same place?" The voice called out again, and this time my heart stopped completely. "Cole," it said in a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years. "Cole, I'm lost. I need help." Miguel's voice. My brother's voice, calling my name from somewhere in the dark forest. Miguel had been dead for 3 years. I'd watched them lower his coffin into the ground after the climbing accident that took him from me. I'd stood at his grave every year on the anniversary, talking to a headstone because that was all I had left of him. But his voice was calling my name from the trees, using the same tone he'd always used when he was in trouble and needed his big brother to help him out. "Cole, please," Miguel's voice called out. "I can't find my way back. I'm scared." My legs felt like they were going to give out. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. Miguel was dead. I'd seen his body after the fall. I'd identified him at the morgue. I'd carried his coffin. But that was definitely his voice. Not similar to his voice. Not someone doing an impression. It was Miguel, speaking to me from somewhere in the forest where he couldn't possibly be. "What the hell is going on?" Tim whispered, his face white with terror. I forced myself to think through the fear and confusion. Miguel was dead. Whatever was in those trees wasn't my brother. but it knew his voice perfectly. It had mimicked Bella's voice, then Terry's voice, and now Miguel's voice. All of them perfect, all of them coming from the same location in the forest. The thing that had been crashing through the trees behind us. The thing that had been moving too fast, making too much noise. It had caught Bella and Terry somehow, and now it was using their voices to try to lure us back. And it knew Miguel's voice. It knew about my dead brother, and was using his voice to get to me emotionally. "It's not them," I said, my voice hoarse. "Whatever's in there, it's not them." "Cole," Miguel's voice called out again, and I could hear the pain in it. The same pain he'd had in his voice the last time I'd talked to him, 3 days before the accident. "Please don't leave me. I need you." Every instinct I had as an older brother was screaming at me to run toward that voice, to find Miguel and help him the way I'd done 1,000 times when we were kids. The way I hadn't been able to do when he'd fallen from that cliff face and died alone in the wilderness. But Miguel was dead, and whatever was using his voice had just taken 2 of my students. "We're leaving," I said, turning away from the tree line. "Now, we're getting out of here." "But Bella and Terry," Gabriel started, "are gone," I finished. "And if we go in there, we'll be gone too." I started down the trail at a fast walk, not quite running, but moving as quickly as I could while still maintaining some control. Behind me, I could hear the others following, their footsteps uncertain and scared. "Cole," Miguel's voice called out one more time, fainter now as we put distance between ourselves and the trees. "Don't leave me alone again." I kept walking, even though every step felt like I was abandoning my brother all over again. Even though the voice sounded so real, so much like Miguel, that part of me was convinced he was really out there needing help. But Miguel was dead, and whatever was hunting us in these woods was using the voices of people we cared about to draw us into its trap. I wasn't going to let it take anyone else. The trail stretched ahead in the growing darkness, each step taking us further from that thing's hunting ground. My legs burned from the pace I'd set, but I couldn't slow down. Not when I knew what was behind us. Terry's scream cut through the forest like a blade. The sound came from maybe 200 yards back, raw terror that made my blood freeze. It went on for 3-4 seconds, long enough for me to picture exactly what was happening to him. Then it stopped, just like Bella's had, clean cut off, like someone had flipped a switch. "Terry!" Gabriel shouted, spinning around on the trail. I grabbed his arm before he could take a step back toward the sound. "Don't." "But he's gone." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, same as Bella. Gabriel's face went white in the fading light. Behind him, Sky had stopped too, her breathing controlled but her eyes wide. Tim stood frozen, clutching his camera bag like it might protect him from what was out there. "We can't just leave him," Gabriel said, but his voice had lost its conviction. He'd heard how Terry's scream had ended. We all had. That thing got him. I kept my grip on Gabriel's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles as he fought the urge to go back. And if we turn around now, it gets us too. The forest had gone quiet again. No wind, no bird calls. Nothing but our ragged breathing and the distant sound of water running over rocks. Willow Creek was close, maybe half a mile. If we could reach it, follow it downstream, we might find a way out of this nightmare. But first we had to survive the next half mile. "Move," I said, pushing Gabriel ahead of me on the trail. "Fast as you can without running, stay together." We fell into a rhythm, Sky behind me, then Gabriel, then Tim bringing up the rear. I could hear Tim's breathing getting heavier, his footsteps starting to stumble on the uneven ground. The kid was running on adrenaline and terror, but that wouldn't last much longer. The trees pressed closer on both sides of the trail, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. I pulled out my headlamp, but didn't turn it on yet. The beam would help us navigate, but it would also announce our position to anything watching from the darkness. Gabriel disappeared between one step and the next. I heard Sky's sharp intake of breath behind me, felt the sudden change in the group's movement. When I turned around, there was just empty space where Gabriel had been walking. No sound, no struggle, no warning. He'd been there, and then he wasn't. Gabriel? Tim's voice cracked on the name. The trail showed no signs of what had happened. No scuff marks, no broken branches, no indication that Gabriel had ever been walking there at all. It was like the forest had simply swallowed him whole. "Where did he go?" Sky whispered, moving closer to me. I scanned the tree line on both sides of the trail, looking for any movement, any sign of where Gabriel might have been taken. The tracking skills he'd been so proud of. All that knowledge about reading signs and following trails, none of it had saved him. Whatever was hunting us moved in ways that left no trace. "Gabriel," Tim called out, louder this time. "Shut up," I hissed, grabbing Tim's shoulder. "You want that thing to know exactly where we are?" Tim's eyes were huge behind his glasses, reflecting what little light filtered through the canopy. But Gabriel is gone. The words came out harder than I meant them to, but there was no time for gentle explanations. "We need to move now." I clicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead of us. The trail continued downhill, winding between massive pine trunks that stood like silent sentinels. Every shadow could hide something waiting to grab us. Every gap between trees could be a trap. We moved faster now, almost jogging down the slope. Sky kept pace easily. Her hiking experience showed in the way she placed her feet, never stumbling even in the uneven light of my headlamp. Tim struggled more, his breathing becoming labored as we pushed through the darkness. That's when we heard Gabriel's voice calling from somewhere in the trees to our left. "Cole, over here! I found something!" The voice was perfect. Gabriel's enthusiasm, his excitement at discovering something new in the wilderness. If I hadn't seen him vanish with my own eyes, I would have believed he was really out there, really calling for us to come see whatever he'd found. "Don't listen," I said, not slowing my pace. "Keep moving." "But that's Gabriel," Tim said, his head turning toward the sound. "He's alive." "No, he's not." I grabbed Tim's arm, pulling him along the trail. "That thing has his voice now, just like it had Bella's and Terry's." The voice called again, closer this time. "Cole, I need help. I'm hurt." Perfect mimicry. The same tone Gabriel had used when he'd cut his hand on a rock during a training exercise last month. The same slight breathlessness, the same edge of pain. If I hadn't been watching when Gabriel disappeared, I might have gone to help. Instead, I pushed us harder down the trail, my headlamp beam bouncing with each step. The sound of running water was getting louder. Willow Creek was close, maybe another quarter mile. Tim's scream echoed through the trees behind us. I spun around, my headlamp beam sweeping across the trail. Sky stood 10 feet back, her face pale in the light. Beyond her, the trail was empty. Tim was gone. "I didn't see anything," Sky said, her voice tight with control. "He was right behind me, and then..." Tim's voice cut through her words, calling from the darkness off to our right. "Help me, please, somebody help me." The same desperate tone, the same fear. But Tim had been 20 years old, full of questions and enthusiasm about wilderness survival. Now his voice was just another tool for the thing that hunted us. "We're the last ones," Sky said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. 4 people under my protection, and I'd watched them all disappear one by one. Miguel's voice had been psychological warfare, but these were real people. People who'd trusted me to keep them safe in the wilderness I knew better than anyone. Except I didn't know this wilderness at all. This forest with its impossible geometry and the thing that moved through it like smoke, taking people without leaving a trace. "The creek," I said, forcing myself to focus on what we could control. "We get to the creek, follow it downstream, find a way out." Sky nodded, falling into step beside me as we continued down the trail. Her breathing was steady, controlled. Whatever fear she was feeling, she wasn't letting it paralyze her. Good. I needed her to stay focused if we were going to survive this. The voices started up again behind us. Gabriel calling for help, Tim crying out in pain, Terry shouting my name. Even Bella's voice, weak and scared, begging us not to leave her alone. The thing was using all of them now, a chorus of the dead trying to lure us back into its trap. I kept walking, even though every instinct screamed at me to help them, even though their voices sounded so real, so desperate. That part of me was convinced they were really out there needing rescue. But they were gone. All of them. And whatever was using their voices wanted us to join them. My legs were done. 3 more steps and I'd be crawling through the pine needles and dead leaves, but I kept pushing anyway. The headlamp beam bounced wildly with each stumbling step, throwing crazy shadows across tree trunks and low branches that seemed to reach for me in the dark. My lungs burned. Every breath felt like swallowing glass, and the cold air made it worse. Behind me, the voices kept coming. "Cole, please don't leave me here." That was Tim's voice. But Tim was gone. Had been gone for who knows how long now. The thing had taken him just like it took the others. But it remembered exactly how he sounded. Every inflection. Every nervous catch in his throat when he got scared. I stumbled over a fallen branch and nearly went down, catching myself against a pine trunk. The bark scraped my palm raw, but I barely felt it. The headlamp beam swept across the forest floor, showing me nothing but more trees stretching endlessly in every direction. No trail, no landmarks, just darkness and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Cole? Now it was Gabriel's voice, coming from maybe 30 yards behind me. "Man, I can't find the trail. Where did you go?" Gabriel, who'd been so confident earlier, examining those bear tracks like he knew what he was doing. Gabriel, who'd wanted to help everyone, who'd tried to go back for Terry and Bella. The thing had his voice down perfectly, even that slight accent I'd noticed when he got excited about something. I forced myself to keep moving even though my legs felt like rubber. The headlamp was starting to dim. How long had I been running? Felt like hours, but could have been 20 minutes. Time didn't mean anything out here anymore. Nothing meant anything except putting one foot in front of the other and not stopping. "Please, Cole, I'm hurt." Bella's voice now, young and scared. "I think my ankle's broken. I can't walk." That one hit harder than the others. Bella, who'd been so out of her element from the start, wearing sneakers on a wilderness hike like she was going to the mall, she'd trusted me to keep her safe. They all had, and I'd failed every single one of them. But Bella was dead. They were all dead. Whatever had taken them was using their voices now, cycling through them like a radio scanning stations, trying to find the frequency that would break me down, make me stop running and come back to help them. "Cole, why did you leave us?" Miguel's voice cut through the night and I nearly tripped again. "I thought you cared about us. I thought we were family." Miguel. My brother who'd been dead for 3 years, who'd never even met these people. But the thing knew his voice somehow, knew exactly how to use it against me. Miguel sounded hurt, disappointed. The same tone he'd used that last time we talked, when I told him his climbing stunts were getting too dangerous. 3 days later, he was dead. I crashed through a patch of low bushes, branches tearing at my jacket. Had to keep moving. Couldn't let it catch up. But my body was shutting down, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear. My vision was starting to tunnel, even with the headlamp. Just a narrow beam of light in an ocean of black. "You always were a coward, Cole." Miguel's voice again, but different now, angry, bitter. "Running away when people need you, just like you ran away from me." That wasn't Miguel. Miguel had never talked to me like that, not even when we fought. The thing was getting desperate, trying different approaches. But knowing it was fake didn't make the words hurt any less. I stumbled into a small clearing and had to stop, hands on my knees, gasping for air. The headlamp beam showed me a circle of pine trees, their trunks black and massive in the darkness. No way to tell which direction I'd come from. No way to know which way to go. Cole, I'm so scared. Sky's voice now coming from the trees behind me. It's got me. It's got me, and I can't get away. Please help me. Sky, who'd been so composed, so confident, who'd kept up with me step for step until the thing took her too. Her voice sounded terrified now, broken in a way I'd never heard before. Even knowing it was fake, every instinct screamed at me to turn around and find her. But Sky was gone, just like the others. I straightened up, trying to think through the exhaustion and panic. The thing was getting closer. I could hear movement in the trees, branches snapping under something heavy. It didn't need to be quiet anymore. It knew I was trapped, knew I was running out of steam. Please, Cole. It hurts so much. Bella's voice again, sobbing now. Why won't you help me? Why won't anyone help me? Each word was chosen perfectly, calculated to tear at whatever was left of my conscience. The thing understood human psychology, understood exactly which buttons to push. It had been hunting people for a long time, learning from each kill. That's when I remembered the riddle. The note Gabriel had found at the house. When shadows dance and spirits call, seek the truth within these walls. Where light breaks through night's domain, the secret waits through joy and pain. Light breaks through night's domain. I'd been so focused on running, on getting away from the thing, that I hadn't really thought about what the riddle meant. But now, standing in this clearing with nothing but my headlamp between me and total darkness, it started to make sense. Light. The riddle was about light. The house had been preserved perfectly, like it was waiting for someone to find it. And the box with the riddle had been sitting right there on the porch, like it was meant to be discovered. What if the whole thing was connected? What if whoever had lived in that house had dealt with this creature before? Cole, I can see you. Tim's voice, much closer now. I'm coming to get you. Just stay right there. The movement in the trees was getting louder, branches cracking, something big pushing through the undergrowth without any attempt at stealth. It didn't need to hide anymore because it thought it had me cornered. Maybe it did, but maybe not. I looked down at the headlamp, watching the beam flicker slightly as the battery weakened. It wasn't much light, barely enough to see 10 feet in front of me, but it was all I had. Light breaks through night's domain. What if that wasn't just poetry? What if it was literal? The thing seemed to avoid direct light, staying in the shadows, taking people when they were separated from the group. It had waited until full darkness to really start hunting. And it had taken Sky right after my headlamp went out. Cole? Sky's voice again, but different this time. Closer. Cole, I found you. Everything's going to be okay now. I turned around slowly, raising the headlamp beam toward the sound. At the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 feet away, something moved between the trees. Tall, human-shaped, coming toward me with steady, measured steps. Thank God you stopped running, the voice continued, still perfectly mimicking Sky's tone and inflection. I've been looking for you everywhere. The others are safe. We found a way out. The figure stepped into the edge of my light, and my blood turned to ice. It was Sky. Exactly Sky. Same height, same build, same dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, same hiking clothes, same confident posture. If I hadn't seen her disappear with my own eyes, I would have believed it was really her. But I knew better. Cole, what's wrong? The thing wearing Sky's face asked, tilting its head with perfect concern. Why are you looking at me like that? Even the facial expressions were right. the slight furrow in her brow when she was confused, the way she held her shoulders when she was trying to read a situation. It had studied her, learned every detail, every mannerism. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected the headlamp beam like an animal's, throwing back cold light that had nothing human in it. I was done running. My legs wouldn't carry me another 50 yards, and there was nowhere left to go anyway. The thing had been herding me deeper into the forest, away from any chance of finding help. It could keep this up all night, using the voices of my dead students and my brother to break me down until I collapsed from exhaustion. But maybe I didn't have to run anymore. Light breaks through night's domain. I adjusted my grip on the headlamp, angling the beam directly at the thing's face. It flinched slightly, taking a half step back, but kept Sky's concerned expression. "Cole, you're scaring me," it said in her voice. "What happened out there? Where are the others?" The light was definitely bothering it, not enough to cause real damage, but enough to make it uncomfortable. The riddle had been right. Light was the key. But my headlamp was already fading, and I'd need more than a dying flashlight to stop something that could perfectly mimic the dead. I thought about the house again, about how well preserved everything had been, about the painting above the fireplace with the woman's face deliberately obscured, about the box left on the porch like a message for future victims. Someone had fought this thing before. Someone had figured out how to hurt it, and they'd left instructions for the next person who'd need them. The thing wearing Sky's face took another step closer, staying just at the edge of my light. "Cole, please," it said, and now there were tears in its eyes, perfect tears that caught the headlamp beam and sparkled like real ones. "I don't understand what's happening. I'm so confused and scared." But I wasn't falling for it anymore. I knew what this thing was, and I knew what I had to do. I reached into my pack and pulled out my emergency flare, the one I always carried for true life or death situations. The thing's eyes widened slightly as I popped the cap and struck the igniter. The flare burst to life with a brilliant red flame, throwing harsh light across the entire clearing. The thing wearing Sky's face let out a shriek that sounded nothing like her voice and stumbled backward, raising its hands to shield its eyes. Now I had a real weapon. I kept the flare high, its red light washing over the clearing in harsh waves. The thing that looked like Sky stumbled backward another step, those animal eyes reflecting the flame like polished glass. The sight made my stomach turn. Everything else about it was perfect. The way she held her shoulders when she was nervous, the slight tilt of her head, even the small scar on her chin from a childhood fall. But those eyes gave it away completely. My headlamp was still clipped to my belt, barely putting out a yellow glow anymore. I reached for it with my free hand, fingers fumbling with the switch. The batteries had maybe another minute or two left in them, but I needed every bit of light I could get. The entity flinched as I raised the headlamp, bringing both beams to bear on its face. That's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. For just a second, the features shifted. Not Sky's face anymore, but Gabriel's concerned expression, the same look he'd worn when examining those bear tracks hours ago. Then it flickered again. Tim's eager smile, the one he'd flashed when taking pictures with his phone. "Cole, please." It was using Sky's voice again, but the mouth movements didn't quite match the words. "I don't understand what's happening. Why are you pointing that light at me?" I kept both beams steady on its face. The thing was good, better than good. If I hadn't seen those reflective eyes, I might have believed it really was her. The voice carried just the right amount of confusion and hurt. Even the way it stood there, arms slightly raised in a defensive gesture, matched exactly how Sky would react to someone threatening her. But I'd watched this thing take 4 people tonight. I'd heard it use their voices to try to lure me back. Whatever it was, wherever it had come from, it wasn't human. And it definitely wasn't Sky. The headlamp flickered once, twice, then steadied again. Not much time left. I needed to act before the light failed completely. "You're not her," I said, keeping my voice level. "I don't know what you are, but you're not Sky." The thing tilted its head, Sky's head, in that characteristic way she had when she was thinking. "Cole, you're scaring me. It's me. Look at me. Really look." I was looking. That was the problem. Every detail was perfect, down to the small freckle near her left ear and the way her hair fell across her forehead. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't seen what this thing could do, I would have lowered the lights and apologized for frightening her. Instead, I took another step back, keeping the distance between us. The flare hissed and sparked, throwing wild shadows across the trees. The red light made everything look like a scene from hell, but it was working. The thing wasn't advancing anymore. If anything, it seemed to be struggling just to maintain Sky's appearance under the direct illumination. "The riddle," I said, more to myself than to it. "When light breaks through night's domain." It was literal. Light actually hurts you. The entity's expression shifted to one of confusion, but I caught another flicker. Just for an instant, Terry's worried face appeared where Sky's had been. Then it snapped back, like a television changing channels. "What riddle?" it asked, still using Sky's voice. "Cole, I think you hit your head when you fell. You're not making sense." But I was making perfect sense for the first time all night. Someone else had encountered this thing before. Someone had survived long enough to figure out its weakness and leave a message for the next poor fool who stumbled into its territory. The painting in the cabin, the woman with the blurred face. That hadn't been artistic choice. That had been a warning. The headlamp dimmed noticeably. Maybe 30 seconds left before it died completely. The flare would last longer, but not much. I needed to end this now. I raised the headlamp higher, angling it to catch the thing directly in those hollow eyes. The effect was immediate. It let out a sound that was definitely not Sky's voice. A low, pained moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. The perfect features wavered like heat shimmer rising from hot pavement. "Stay back," I warned, though I wasn't sure if it could understand me anymore. The human facade was starting to crack. The thing tried to take a step forward, but the combined light from both sources seemed to create a barrier it couldn't cross. Its movements became jerky, unnatural. Sky's face flickered again. Gabriel, Tim, Terry. Faces I'd never seen before. Old faces, young faces, all wearing expressions of pain and terror. How long had this thing been here? How many people had it taken over the years? The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. The headlamp gave one final flicker and died. The entity immediately surged forward, sensing weakness. But I still had the flare, and I thrust it directly at its face. The brilliant red flame came within inches of its skin, and the thing let out a shriek that made my earlier comparison to hell seem inadequate. This sound was pure agony, the cry of something being burned alive from the inside out. The perfect features began to melt. Not literally, but the illusion couldn't hold under the direct assault of light. Sky's face stretched and distorted, her eyes becoming empty black holes, her mouth opening impossibly wide. The other faces appeared and disappeared in rapid succession, all the people it had taken, all the identities it had stolen. I kept the flare steady, my arm aching from holding it extended. The thing writhed and twisted, but it couldn't seem to move away from the light. Something about the direct illumination had it trapped, locked in place, while the stolen faces peeled away layer by layer. Finally, mercifully, the screaming stopped. Where the entity had been standing, there was nothing, not empty space, actual nothing. A patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the flare's light rather than reflect it. No shape, no substance, just an absence that hurt to look at directly. I blinked, and even that was gone. The clearing was empty except for me and the hissing flare. Wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant ocean waves. Normal forest sounds began to return. The rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the creak of branches settling. The oppressive silence that had blanketed everything since we'd found the cabin was finally lifting. I stood there for a long moment, flare still raised, waiting for the thing to reappear. But the forest felt different now, cleaner somehow, like a fever breaking. The flare was burning down fast. I had maybe 2 minutes before it died completely, leaving me alone in the dark. But somehow, I wasn't afraid anymore. The presence that had been stalking us all night was gone. I could feel its absence the same way you notice when a headache finally stops. Still, I waited. The thing had been clever, patient. It had used perfect mimicry to try to lure me back time and again. I wasn't going to assume it was dead just because I couldn't see it anymore. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The flare burned down to a stub, casting weaker and weaker light across the clearing. Normal night sounds continued around me. An owl calling somewhere in the distance, the scurry of something small through fallen leaves. Nothing that suggested a supernatural predator lurking just beyond the light. When the flare finally died, I didn't immediately panic. The darkness was complete, but it felt like ordinary darkness now, not the malevolent black presence that had been hunting us. Just regular forest night, the kind I'd spent countless hours in during my years as a guide. I pulled out my backup flashlight, smaller than the headlamp, but with fresh batteries. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing more threatening than pine trees and undergrowth. The clearing where I'd made my stand looked perfectly normal now. Just another small gap in the forest canopy. Time to go. I needed to get back to the main trail, get to the ranger station, call for help. There would be search and rescue teams, questions I didn't know how to answer, reports that no one would believe. But that was a problem for later. Right now, I just needed to get out of these woods. I oriented myself using the North Star, visible through the gap in the trees above. The main trail should be southeast of my current position, maybe half a mile through the forest. In daylight, with proper landmarks, it would be an easy hike. In the dark, with only a small flashlight and my sense of direction to guide me, it would be more challenging, but not impossible. I started walking, picking my way carefully through the undergrowth. Every few steps, I stopped to listen, making sure I wasn't being followed. But the forest remained peacefully normal. Whatever that thing had been, the light had destroyed it completely. The hike back to the trail took longer than I'd expected. I had to detour around fallen logs and thick patches of brush, constantly checking my direction to avoid getting turned around. But eventually, my flashlight beam caught the familiar packed earth of the main hiking path. I'd never been so happy to see a trail in my life. From there, it was just a matter of following the path back toward the trailhead. My legs felt like rubber, and exhaustion was starting to hit me hard now that the adrenaline was wearing off. But I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, putting distance between myself and the cabin that had started this nightmare. The ranger station appeared ahead, a squat building with solar panels on the roof and a small parking area out front. Lights were on inside. Someone was working the night shift. I broke into a run for the last 100 yards, my boots pounding against the gravel parking lot. Human voices had never sounded so good. The ranger station door opened before I could reach for the handle. A woman in a green uniform stepped out, coffee mug in hand, and nearly dropped it when she saw me stumbling across the gravel. Jesus, what happened to you? I must have looked like hell. My jacket was torn in 3 places. Dirt caked my pants from knee to boot, and I could feel dried sweat mixing with pine sap on my face. The smell of burned flare chemicals probably clung to my clothes. I need to report missing persons, I said. 5 people. My students. The ranger, her name tag read Martinez, guided me inside to a small office that smelled like coffee and paperwork. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright after hours in the forest. She handed me a bottle of water and grabbed a notepad. "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her about the hiking group, the wrong turn, finding the cabin. I described the box Gabriel had discovered, the note with its riddle about light and shadows. I explained how the screech had sent us running, how Terry and Bella disappeared first, then Gabriel, then Tim, how something had taken Sky right in front of me. Martinez wrote everything down, asking for names, ages, emergency contacts, standard procedure. She didn't react when I mentioned the voices calling from the forest, mimicking my students perfectly. Didn't even blink when I described the entity wearing Sky's face. "This creature," she said, pen hovering over her notepad. "Can you describe it in more detail? It could look like anyone. Perfect copies. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected light like an animal's. And when I hit it with the flare, all these faces started melting off it. Faces I'd never seen before." She kept writing. Professional. Thorough. I thought maybe she believed me, or at least was taking it seriously enough to document everything properly. "We'll need to organize a search party," Martinez said. "Can you guide us back to where this happened?" Relief flooded through me. Finally, someone was listening. 2 hours later, I was leading a team of 6 rangers and 2 sheriff's deputies back into the forest. My legs felt steadier now, fueled by determination and the protein bar Martinez had given me. These people were trained for wilderness rescue. They'd find evidence of what happened. They'd understand. I knew the trail by heart, even in darkness. Every turn, every landmark. The fork where we'd taken the wrong path was exactly where I remembered it. I led the team through the gap in the trees, following the same route we'd taken to reach the cabin. Except there was no cabin. The clearing was there, roughly the right size and shape. But instead of a weathered log structure with a covered porch, we found an empty space surrounded by pine trees. No foundation stones, no rotted wood, no rusted metal hardware from the door. "This is where it was," I said, sweeping my flashlight across the bare ground. "Right here." The front door was facing that direction. Deputy Carson, a heavy-set man with 20 years of experience written in the lines around his eyes, examined the dirt carefully. "I don't see any evidence of recent construction, or old construction for that matter." "There was a stone fireplace," I insisted, "a wooden table, chairs, bookshelves, the painting above the fireplace, a woman in white with her face all blurred out." Ranger Martinez walked the perimeter of the clearing. "The soil composition looks natural, no disturbance patterns you'd expect from building removal." I knew what I'd seen. That cabin had been real. Solid. Gabriel had circled it, checking the foundation. We'd all been inside together. The box with the photographs and the riddle note had been sitting right there on the front porch. "Maybe I'm remembering the location wrong," I said, though I knew I wasn't. "Let's check the area around here." We spent 3 hours searching a half-mile radius. The team was thorough, professional. They found deer tracks, some old campsites, a few pieces of litter left by previous hikers. No cabin. No sign that a building had ever existed in this section of forest. No sign of my students either. The search continued for 6 days. More teams arrived, K-9 units, volunteer groups, even a helicopter that swept the canopy with thermal imaging. They covered every square mile of Pine Ridge, following water sources, checking caves, examining any structure that might have been confused for an old cabin. Nothing. I stayed at a motel in town, calling Martinez twice daily for updates. Each conversation was shorter than the last. Professional courtesy wearing thin under the weight of an impossible situation. On day 4, she asked me to come back to the station. "We've had teams out there around the clock," Martinez said, spreading topographical maps across her desk. "We've covered the entire Pine Ridge area. No trace of your students, no evidence of the cabin you described." "It was there," I said. I know how this sounds, but Cole. She used my first name now, which felt like a bad sign. I need to ask you some questions about your mental state that day. Had you been drinking? Taking any medications? When was the last time you'd eaten? The questions kept coming. Had I been under stress lately? Any history of hallucinations, sleep deprivation, drug use? Each question felt like a small betrayal, chipping away at the truth I knew. You think I made this up? I said. I think you experienced something traumatic. But we can't find any physical evidence to support your account of events. 2 days later, Detective Williams from the County Sheriff's Department took over the case. Older than Martinez, with gray hair and skeptical eyes that had seen too many stories that didn't add up. Let's go through this again, he said, settling into the chair across from me. 5 people went hiking with you. None of them came back. But you survived. I told you what happened. You told me about a creature that doesn't exist and a building that was never there. Williams opened a manila folder. I've been looking into your background, Cole. 8 years as a wilderness guide, clean safety record. Until 3 years ago. My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. Your brother Miguel, climbing accident in Colorado. You were supposed to be his partner that day, but you backed out last minute. He went alone and fell. That has nothing to do with this. Survivor's guilt can manifest in strange ways. Sometimes people create elaborate scenarios to explain tragedies they feel responsible for. The room felt smaller suddenly. Williams leaned forward, his voice taking on a practiced sympathy that made my skin crawl. What really happened out there, Cole? Did you make some kind of mistake? Wrong turn that led your group into danger? Maybe someone got hurt and you panicked? I've told you exactly what happened. Have you? Because the story you're telling involves monsters and disappearing buildings. That's not a story a rational person tells unless they're trying to cover something up. The questions became accusations. Where were the bodies? Had I buried them somewhere in the forest? Was this some kind of insurance fraud scheme? Williams painted scenarios where I was everything from a confused trauma victim to a cold-blooded killer. I stopped talking to him after that. The official report came out 2 weeks later. 5 hikers listed as missing, presumed dead due to exposure and environmental hazards. The report noted that their guide, Cole Reed, had been found in a state of severe psychological distress, claiming to have witnessed supernatural events that could not be corroborated by physical evidence. No mention of the creature. No mention of the voices in the forest. No mention of the entity that had worn my students' faces while their stolen features melted away under the flare's light. The families of my students received copies of that report. Tim's parents, Gabriel's sister, Bella's grandmother who'd raised her, Terry's ex-wife and teenage daughter, Sky's brother who lived in Portland. They all knew my name now. They all knew I was the one who'd brought their loved ones into the forest and come out alone. I tried calling some of them, tried explaining what had really happened. Tim's mother hung up on me. Gabriel's sister threatened to call the police if I contacted her again. The others wouldn't take my calls at all. 3 weeks after that night in the forest, I was sitting in Dr. Sarah Chen's office, mandated psychological evaluation before I could return to work. She was younger than me, with kind eyes and a gentle voice that somehow made everything worse. The mind has ways of protecting us from trauma, she said. Sometimes it creates alternate narratives to help us process experiences that are too difficult to accept. So you think I'm lying? I think you believe everything you've told me, but belief and objective reality aren't always the same thing. She prescribed medication for anxiety and depression, recommended regular therapy sessions, suggested I take extended time off from guiding to focus on my mental health. Everyone had decided what the truth was. Cole Reed, experienced wilderness guide, had suffered some kind of psychotic break and constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain the deaths of 5 people under his supervision. The alternative, that something inhuman was hunting in Pine Ridge, was too impossible to consider. I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the official report. 5 people presumed dead. No mention of what had actually killed them. The creature was still out there, still hunting, and nobody would ever look for it because nobody believed it existed. The truth didn't matter if no one would accept it. I could keep insisting on what I'd seen, what I'd fought, what I'd barely escaped. But that path led to more questions about my sanity, more suspicion about my involvement, more isolation from a world that had already decided I was either crazy or criminal. I understood the choice I was facing: accept their version of events, traumatized guide, tragic accident, psychological breakdown, or face the consequences of continuing to tell an impossible truth that made me look guilty of something far worse than surviving. But I knew what had happened to Skye, Gabriel, Tim, Bella, and Terry. I knew what was still out there in the forest, wearing stolen faces and mimicking voices of the dead. The official report could call it exposure and environmental hazards all it wanted. That thing had killed my students, and I was the only one who knew it was real. I handed in my resignation on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after Pine Ridge. The paperwork felt heavier than it should have. Just 2 sheets explaining my departure from Wilderness Survival Solutions. After 8 years of leading groups through forests I now couldn't stand to think about. My supervisor, Janet, read through it twice, her reading glasses perched on her nose while I sat across from her desk trying not to fidget. "This is sudden, Cole," she said, setting the papers down. "You've been on leave since the incident, but I thought you might want to ease back into things. Maybe start with day trips, local trails." Local trails. The phrase made my stomach clench. Even thinking about stepping into treeline again sent my pulse racing. I'd tried once about 3 weeks ago, driving out to Sunset Ridge, a basic beginner trail I'd walked hundreds of times. I'd made it maybe 50 feet past the parking area before turning around and driving home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. "I can't do it anymore," I told Janet. "The wilderness thing, I'm done." She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting this conversation. Everyone at the company knew what had happened, or at least the official version. Tragic hiking accident, 5 people lost to exposure and environmental hazards. Sole survivor suffering severe psychological trauma. The story that made sense to people who lived in a world where creatures didn't steal faces and mimic voices of the dead. "Have you thought about what you'll do next?" I had. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, lying awake in my cabin at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and settling sound the old building made. The cabin sat on 12 acres of pine forest, the same kind of trees that had surrounded that impossible house where Gabriel found the box and everything went wrong. I couldn't stay there anymore. Couldn't wake up every morning and see those trees through my bedroom window. "Moving to the city," I said. "Portland. Got a friend there who thinks he can get me work in construction." Janet raised an eyebrow. "Construction? Cole, you've been guiding wilderness trips since you were 22. You know these mountains better than anyone." That was the problem. I knew exactly what was still out there in those mountains, wearing stolen faces and waiting for the next group of hikers to take a wrong turn. But I couldn't explain that to Janet without sounding like I belonged in a psychiatric ward. "Need a change," I said instead. "Complete change." She signed the paperwork without any more questions. I cleaned out my desk, loaded my truck, and drove away from the mountains that had been my life for over a decade. Portland felt like stepping into a different world. Concrete and steel instead of pine and granite, car horns instead of bird calls, crowds of people instead of empty trails. I rented a studio apartment on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse in the industrial district. No trees visible from any window, just other buildings and pavement, and the constant hum of traffic. The noise bothered me at first. I'd grown used to forest silence. But after a few weeks, I realized the urban soundtrack actually helped. It drowned out other sounds. Sounds that might not be real, but felt real enough to jolt me awake at 2 in the morning. My friend Derek got me work with his construction crew, mostly residential renovations. The physical labor felt good, familiar in a way that surprised me. My hands had always been better with tools than with words, whether I was setting up camp or building a deck. The other guys didn't ask many questions about my background. Derek had told them I was getting out of outdoor work, and that seemed like enough explanation for everyone. The nightmares started about 2 weeks after I moved to the city. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of pine sap and fear thick in my mouth. In the dreams, I was always running through that forest again, my headlamp dying, hearing voices calling from the darkness behind me. Tim pleading not to be left behind. Gabriel claiming he was lost and needed help. Bella sobbing about her broken ankle. And always, Miguel's voice cutting through the others like a blade. "Cole, where are you? I'm scared, Cole. Please don't leave me." The first few times it happened, I'd bolt upright and immediately reach for the lamp beside my bed, flooding the small apartment with light. I'd sit there for an hour or more, fully dressed, checking every corner and shadow until my heart rate returned to normal. The rational part of my brain knew I was safe. 4th floor apartment, locked door, no forests for miles. But rationality didn't have much power at 3 a.m. when Miguel's voice still echoed in my ears. After the 5th or 6th nightmare, I started sleeping with all the lights on. It helped mostly. The apartment stayed bright all night. Overhead fixture, desk lamp, reading light, even the bathroom light with the door cracked open. My electric bill doubled, but I didn't care. Light had saved my life in that clearing when the creature wearing Sky's face had tried to lure me closer. Light had made the thing's stolen features melt away like candle wax. I wasn't taking any chances. My downstairs neighbor complained about the glow coming through my windows at night, said it was keeping her awake. I bought blackout curtains and kept the lights on anyway. Work became my anchor. 8 hours a day of focusing on measurements and materials, learning new skills, letting my body get tired enough that sleep might come easier. The crew was renovating a Victorian house in the Pearl District, stripping old wallpaper and replacing rotted floor joists. Detailed work that required concentration. I threw myself into it completely, volunteering for overtime, staying late to finish sections that could have waited until tomorrow. Derek noticed my dedication, but misread the motivation. "Good to see you getting back on your feet," he said one afternoon while we took a break on the front porch. "Whatever happened out there in the woods really messed you up for a while." I nodded and took a long drink from my water bottle. Derek knew the basic story: hiking accident, people died. I survived. He didn't know about the creature or the voices or the way light had been the only thing standing between me and whatever fate had claimed my students. Nobody knew that part, except the rangers and police who'd written it off as trauma-induced hallucination. "Time heals," Derek continued. "You just gotta give it space to work." Time. 6 months felt like 6 years sometimes, and other times it felt like the whole thing had happened yesterday. I could still smell the chemical burn of that emergency flare, still see the creature's features shifting and melting under the direct light, still hear the screams of stolen faces being stripped away layer by layer. "Yeah," I said, "working on it." The therapist was Dr. Michelle Santos, recommended by the Employee Assistance Program at Derek's construction company. Her office was on the 15th floor of a downtown building, windows overlooking the Willamette River. Clean and professional, with certificates on the walls and a bookshelf full of psychology texts. Nothing like the wilderness therapy some people had suggested, which would have involved hiking and outdoor reflection. I'd made it clear that approach was completely off the table. "Tell me about the nightmares," Dr. Santos said during our third session. She was maybe 45, with graying hair and a calm manner that probably worked well with most patients. "You mentioned they're recurring. Same scenario each time?" I shifted in the leather chair across from her desk. We'd covered the basic timeline in our first 2 meetings: the hiking trip, the accident, the loss of 5 people under my supervision. The official version, sanitized for professional consumption. Running through the forest, I said, hearing voices calling for help, people from the group who didn't make it out. That's a common trauma response, she said, making notes on her pad. Survivor's guilt, manifesting as auditory hallucinations. Your mind is processing the guilt you feel about being unable to save them. Auditory hallucinations. The clinical term made it sound manageable, like a symptom that could be treated with the right combination of therapy and medication. She'd already prescribed something for anxiety and depression, small white pills I took every morning with coffee. They took the edge off the panic attacks, but didn't do much for the dreams. The voices, Dr. Santos continued. Do they say specific things, or is it more general calls for help? This was where I had to be careful. The truth was that the voices said very specific things, exact phrases I remembered from that night. Tim's desperate. Please don't leave me, Cole. Gabriel's confused. I'm lost. I can't find the trail. Bella's pain-filled. My ankle's broken. I can't walk. And Miguel. Miguel's voice saying things he'd actually said 3 years ago during our last conversation. Word for word. General stuff, I lied. Just calling my name, asking for help. She nodded and wrote something down. And you mentioned one of the voices belongs to your brother Miguel, who died several years ago. That's particularly significant from a psychological standpoint. I'd made the mistake of mentioning Miguel during our second session, trying to explain why that particular voice affected me so strongly. But I'd framed it as my traumatized mind mixing past and present grief, not as evidence that some creature in the forest had somehow accessed memories of my dead brother. Trauma has a way of pulling our deepest fears and losses to the surface, Dr. Santos explained. Your brother's death was clearly a significant emotional event, and now your mind is connecting that loss with the recent tragedy. It's creating a narrative where all the people you couldn't save are calling out to you. The explanation made perfect sense from her perspective. Textbook trauma response, survivor's guilt, complicated grief, all very treatable with time and proper therapeutic intervention. She had no way of knowing that Miguel's voice in the forest had used the exact words from our phone call 3 days before his climbing accident, when he'd called to ask if I wanted to join him on what turned out to be his final climb. I'm scared about this route, Cole. It's more technical than anything I've done before. Could really use a spotter. I'd been busy that weekend, distracted by work and a relationship that was falling apart. I'd told him I couldn't make it, that he should find someone else or pick an easier climb. 3 days later, he was dead. Fallen from a cliff face he'd attempted alone because I hadn't been there to talk him out of it. The creature in the forest had known those words, had spoken them in Miguel's exact voice, with the same nervous energy he'd had during that phone call. There was no way my traumatized mind could have fabricated that level of detail, but I couldn't explain that to Dr. Santos without undermining everything we'd built in our sessions. The important thing, she said, is that you're seeking help. Many people in your situation try to handle trauma alone, which often makes things worse. You're taking positive steps toward healing. I nodded and agreed and scheduled another appointment for the following week. The therapy helped in some ways. Having someone to talk to, learning coping strategies for the anxiety, getting medication that made daily life more manageable. But it was all built on the foundation of a lie. Dr. Santos was treating me for a psychological condition when what I'd experienced was something else entirely. The worst part was the doubt that crept in during quiet moments. Late at night, when the apartment was blazing with light and I was staring at the ceiling, I'd sometimes wonder if she was right. If my mind had created an elaborate fantasy to cope with the reality of losing 5 people under my supervision. Maybe there had been no creature. Maybe I'd gotten confused in the dark forest, led my group off the trail, and they'd died of exposure while I wandered in circles having a complete psychological breakdown. The official report certainly supported that theory. No evidence of any supernatural threat, no trace of the cabin Gabriel had found, no indication that anything had happened beyond a tragic hiking accident involving an unstable guide. Everyone from the rangers to the police to the families of the victims had accepted that version of events. But then I'd remember the feel of that emergency flare in my hand, the way the creature's stolen faces had melted under direct light, the inhuman screech it had made before disappearing into darkness. Those memories felt solid, real, undeniable, more real than anything else from that night. The doubt was almost worse than the nightmares. At least when I woke up screaming, I knew what I was afraid of. The uncertainty left me questioning everything: my memory, my sanity, my ability to distinguish between reality and trauma-induced fantasy. 3 months into my new life in Portland, I was walking home from work when I heard Miguel's voice call my name from an alley between 2 buildings. "Cole. Hey, Cole." I stopped dead on the sidewalk, my tool bag sliding off my shoulder. The voice was coming from the narrow space between a coffee shop and a vintage clothing store, maybe 20 feet away. Same tone, same inflection, same slight rasp Miguel had developed from years of climbing in dusty conditions. My rational mind kicked in immediately. Auditory hallucination, just like Dr. Santos had explained. Trauma-induced phantom sounds, my brain playing tricks on me. I was tired, stressed, probably hadn't eaten enough lunch. Simple explanation. But my body reacted before my rational mind could take control. I spun toward the alley, my hand automatically reaching for a knife that wasn't there, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Cole, I need help. I'm lost." The words were exactly what the creature had said in the forest, using Miguel's voice to try to lure me back into the trees. But this was downtown Portland, broad daylight, dozens of people walking past on the busy street. No creature could be here. No stolen faces or melting features or inhuman screams. I forced myself to walk to the mouth of the alley and look inside. Empty except for a dumpster and some scattered trash. No Miguel, no creature, no anything. Just an ordinary urban alley that smelled like garbage and old coffee grounds. "You okay, man?" I turned to find a guy about my age standing behind me, wearing a food delivery uniform and looking concerned. I realized I'd been standing there for several minutes, staring into an empty alley while people walked around me on the sidewalk. "Yeah," I said, picking up my tool bag. "Thought I heard someone calling for help." He glanced into the alley, then back at me. "Don't see anybody. Maybe check with the coffee shop. Could be someone needs assistance inside." I thanked him and continued walking home, but the sound of Miguel's voice followed me for blocks. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a trauma response, exactly what Dr. Santos would have predicted. Stress from work, approaching the 6-month anniversary of the incident, normal progression of PTSD symptoms. But that night, lying in bed with every light in the apartment blazing, I couldn't shake the feeling that Miguel's voice had sounded too real, too immediate, too much like it had in the forest when the creature had used it as bait. I told myself these were just trauma-induced auditory hallucinations, but they felt disturbingly real and familiar. The sound pierced through the glass like it was nothing at all. "Cole." My hands went still on the laptop keyboard. 3 floors down, traffic hummed along the street, but that voice cut through everything else with perfect clarity. Same tone, same inflection, same way Miguel always said my name when he needed something. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. My reflection stared back from the black glass, pale and hollow-eyed in the overhead light. Beyond it, the industrial district stretched out in patches of streetlight and shadow. Empty loading docks, parked delivery trucks. The kind of urban landscape that should have felt safe after months of avoiding anything that resembled wilderness. "Cole, where are you?" There it was again. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and searched the darkness below. Nothing moved except a plastic bag tumbling across the empty street. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the way sound carried strangely in the city at night. Dr. Santos would call this a textbook auditory hallucination. Stress response triggered by the approaching anniversary. Trauma manifesting in familiar patterns. She'd probably increase my medication dosage and recommend more frequent sessions. All very reasonable, all very logical. Except Miguel sounded exactly the same as he had in the forest 6 months ago. Not memory distant or dream fuzzy, but immediate and real. Like he was standing right outside my building calling up to my window. I backed away from the glass and reached for the light switch by the door. The overhead fixture was already on, but I flicked it anyway, needing the reassurance of that solid click. Then I moved through the apartment systematically, checking every light source. Desk lamp, on. Reading light by the bed, on. Kitchen fluorescents, on. Bathroom light with the door cracked open, on. The routine calmed me, the same way it had every night for the past 3 months. Light meant safety. Light meant I could see what was real and what wasn't. Light meant the creature couldn't get close enough to steal faces and voices and use them as weapons. I settled back at the desk, but couldn't focus on the laptop screen. Outside, Portland went about its business. Late shift workers heading home, bar crowds spilling onto sidewalks, normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that something impossible had happened in the Pine Ridge wilderness. The official report sat in my filing cabinet, all 12 pages of bureaucratic language that transformed 5 deaths into a tragic hiking accident, environmental hazards, exposure, poor decision-making by an inexperienced guide suffering from previous trauma. The investigators had covered every angle except the actual truth, because the actual truth would have gotten them laughed out of their jobs or committed for psychological evaluation. I understood their position now. Accepting my account meant accepting that something supernatural stalked those woods, something that could perfectly mimic human voices and appearances. It meant admitting that all their training and equipment and procedures were useless against a threat that shouldn't exist. Much easier to blame human error and psychological breakdown. The families believed the official version because they needed someone to blame, and I was the only target available. Tim's mother had screamed at me over the phone before hanging up. Gabriel's sister threatened to file charges. Terry's father sent letters through his lawyer. They all wanted justice for their children, and I was the closest thing to a responsible party they could find. I didn't blame them. If someone had brought me news that Miguel died under impossible circumstances, I would have demanded answers too. Real answers. Not stories about shape-shifting creatures and riddles hidden in phantom cabins. But I knew what I had experienced in that clearing. The weight of the flare in my hand. The way the creature's stolen faces melted away under direct light. The absolute silence that followed when it finally disappeared. Those memories stayed sharp and clear while everything else from that night blurred together. The riddle had been the key. When shadows dance and spirits call, seek the truth within these walls. Where light breaks through night's domain, the secret waits through joy and pain. Someone else had encountered the creature before and left instructions for future victims. Someone who understood that light was both weapon and shield against something that fed on darkness and sorrow. I had solved the puzzle just in time to save my own life, but not soon enough to save my students. That knowledge sat in my chest like a physical weight, heavier than any guilt about wrong turns or poor leadership decisions. I had failed them not through incompetence, but through ignorance of what we were really facing. Now I was the only person alive who knew the truth about Pine Ridge, the only one who understood that the creature was still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble across its territory. And I was completely powerless to do anything about it. Who would believe me? Park Service officials who had already dismissed my account, local authorities who had closed the case, other wilderness guides who would see me as a liability to the entire industry. I had tried talking to Dr. Santos about the specifics during our early sessions, but she immediately steered the conversation toward trauma processing and coping mechanisms. The medical establishment had neat categories for everything I described: auditory hallucinations, visual distortions, dissociative episodes, survivor's guilt manifesting as elaborate fantasy scenarios. They could explain away every detail of my experience without ever addressing the central question of what actually happened to 5 healthy adults in familiar wilderness. So I played along. I took the medication and attended therapy sessions and nodded when Dr. Santos talked about healing timelines and adjustment disorders. I let everyone believe I was a traumatized guide slowly recovering from a tragic accident, because the alternative was much worse. The alternative was being seen as either completely insane or criminally responsible. Those were the only 2 options available to someone who insisted on an impossible truth: mental health commitment or criminal investigation, both leading to the same place: complete destruction of any remaining credibility or freedom. Better to be the broken survivor than the delusional suspect. But late at night, when Miguel's voice drifted up from the empty streets below, I couldn't maintain the pretense even for myself. I knew exactly what I had heard in that forest. I knew exactly what had taken my students. And I knew it was still out there, patient and hungry, waiting for the next opportunity to feed. Other hikers would find that area eventually. Someone would take a wrong turn or follow an unmarked trail or simply wander off the established routes. They would see the cabin that shouldn't exist and investigate, because human curiosity always wins over caution. They would find the box with its cryptic warning and dismiss it as some kind of prank or historical artifact. Then they would hear the screech, and I would never know about it until their families started demanding answers that no one could provide. Another tragic hiking accident. Another case of environmental hazards and poor preparation. Another file closed with reasonable explanations that avoided the unreasonable truth. The creature had probably been hunting in those woods for decades, maybe longer. How many missing persons reports had been filed over the years? How many unsolved disappearances had been attributed to natural causes? How many families had been told their loved ones simply got lost and succumbed to exposure? I pulled up news archives on my laptop and searched for Pine Ridge missing persons cases. The results made my stomach clench. Dozens of reports going back 30 years. Solo hikers who never returned. Camping groups that vanished without a trace. Search and rescue operations that found abandoned equipment but no bodies. All explained away with standard wilderness statistics. People got lost. People made mistakes. People underestimated the dangers of backcountry travel. Reasonable explanations that satisfied everyone except the families left behind. But now, I could see the pattern. The creature had been feeding for years, taking people one by one or in small groups, always careful not to create too much attention. It was intelligent enough to space out its hunting, patient enough to wait for the right opportunities. And it was still out there. I closed the laptop and walked back to the window. The street below remained empty except for a few parked cars and the occasional pedestrian hurrying past. Normal city sounds drifted up through the glass. Normal city life continuing around me. But I could feel the weight of all those unsolved cases. All those families who never got real answers. I was the only person who knew what had really happened to their loved ones, and I couldn't tell them without destroying my own life in the process. The voice came again, softer this time, but still unmistakably Miguel. "Cole, I'm scared." I gripped the window frame and forced myself to breathe slowly. Just another hallucination. Just trauma echoes bouncing around my damaged psyche. Nothing more than electrical misfires in a brain that had seen too much and couldn't process it properly. But Miguel sounded so real, so immediate, so much like the brother I had failed to save 3 years ago, and failed to save again when the creature used his voice as bait. I checked every light in the apartment again, making sure each bulb burned bright against the darkness pressing in from outside. Then I settled into the chair by my desk and prepared to wait for dawn, the way I had learned to do whenever the voices returned. Somewhere in the Pine Ridge wilderness, the creature waited too, patient and hungry, ready for the next group of hikers to stumble into its trap. And I was the only person alive who knew enough to stop it, trapped in a city apartment with the knowledge that no one would ever believe.